It's just an incredible story of how important it is, Anthony, and you know this. The choice of the CEO is incredibly important. And one of the tragedies of GE is, of course, Jack Welch, who was so successful, the manager of the century, who took over GE when it was worth $12 billion and made it worth $650 billion. Had a very public succession process, 2 years on the front page of the Wall Street Journal every other week, and chose Jeff Immelt. And the first thing out of his mouth when I sat down with him at the Nantucket Country Club in August of whatever it was, 2018, was, I fucked up.
I was at a speech, Allen and Company, at the Sun Valley Conference, year 2000. Warren Buffett gave a speech about the ephemeral nature of corporations. And he basically said that, take a look at this list. And nobody recognized the list. He said, okay, well, that was the Dow in 1900. It's 100 years later now, 2000. And there was one name on the list that we all recognized, which was General Electric. Of course, Buffett pointed out that it was taken out of the Dow temporarily in the 20s and put back into the Dow. And he was making the case that there's been no company since the origination of the Dow 30 stocks that's actually stayed in the Dow 30. It's had been a constant circulation as times change and corporations change. But what happens? Is it like an empire? Is it like a family? The expression, your shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Is it a cultural thing? Is it a circumstantial? Do we personalize things that are situational? Does technology change? Or do you think it was something devastatingly flawed about General Electric's culture?
Well, I think there was an aspect to all of what you just mentioned that resulted in the downfall of the company, which is now being split up and, never more. Look, I think part of it is that the great age of conglomerates is over. So once upon a time, investors loved conglomerates. Now they don't love conglomerates. And so I think the support wasn't there from the investor community. But the real catalyst for the downfall, I think that the GE, because it was so iconic and because it was in many ways a combination of Apple and Microsoft and Google, rolled up into one for a very long time. It was an amazing technological leader in this country for a very long time, and still is an important technological leader. But what I think none of us really fully appreciated, although I did since I worked there, was that GE, in addition to being, a leading manufacturer of healthcare equipment and jet engines and power, electricity generating plants, et cetera, on and on and on, was that it was a very large non-bank bank. It was a very large unregulated financial institution that relied on the short-term financing markets, the commercial paper markets, for its, a lot of its capital. And then it did the exact same thing, Anthony, that we just saw in spades with Silicon Valley Bank. It borrowed short and lent long, the classic mistake of lending institutions and financial institutions. And I think that while Jack Welch, who really created, it was around before Jack, obviously, but he really exploited the opportunity, the financial opportunity that GE Capital presented to GE. He literally got off on arbitraging GE's AAA credit rating, its ability to borrow money very cheaply, just above treasuries, and then lending it out and making a lot of money on lending it out, and being expensive too. We used to get warrants in stock in the deals that we financed, just like Mike Milken did at Drexel Burnham. And, he told me that it was a lot easier to make money from money than it was to make money bending metal into, an aircraft engine. And of course, he was absolutely right. And it became something like 50% of GE's profits. The problem became, of course, like it did across the spectrum in 2007 and 2008, is that while I think Jack understood the risks at GE Capital, and had people like Gary Wendt and Dennis Maiden in charge of GE Capital, who really understood what risk taking was all about. Jeff Immelt was a different animal. He was a more of a marketing guy. I don't think he really, in his heart of hearts, understood the risks that were lurking at GE Capital, especially when the shit hit the fan, as it did across the board in 2007 and 2008. And that's what became the catalyst for the downfall of GE. People, were focused on the Wall Street banks in 2008, as they rightly should have been, and on the car companies, and on the big insurance companies like AIG. Most people don't even realize that GE almost went down the tubes. GE Capital almost filed for bankruptcy twice, and if Jeff Immelt hadn't gone to Hank Paulson and 𝗕cie𝗵𝗵𝗿 at the FDIC and begged for a bailout, GE was not part of the TARP. They had to beg for a special situation bailout access to financial lines that the Fed and the Treasury are making available.
They got Buffett to make an investment as well, right?
They got Buffett to make an investment, just like he did it in Goldman Sachs and in Bank of America. Of course, paying Warren made a ton of money on that investment. They raised capital from the public as a result of Warren's investment, just like Goldman Sachs was able to do. To Warren's credit, he sees great companies in distress and knows what to do and takes chances when others won't. But that led to a series of situations that ultimately resulted in the downfall of the company, which I document, in the book. And it's just an incredible story of how important it is, Anthony, and you know this. The choice of the CEO is incredibly important, and one of the tragedies of GE is, of course, Jack Welch, who was so successful, the manager of the century, who took over GE when it was worth $12 billion and made it worth $650 billion. Had a very public succession process, 2 years on the front page of the Wall Street Journal every other week. And chose Jeff Immelt. And the first thing out of his mouth when I sat down with him at the Nantucket Country Club in August of whatever it was, 2018, was, I fucked up. He literally said that to me. I fucked up and I chose the wrong guy to be my successor. And, there are consequences for those decisions.
Could Jack Welch have kept that company together?
I get asked this, a lot, and it's one of those hypotheticals we'll never know the answer to. But I believe Jack understood better than Jeff the risks that were embedded at GE Capital. I believe that, Jack got rid of Gary Wendt because he thought Gary, was too ambitious and embarrassed the company with his divorce. Of course, Jack embarrassed the company with his divorces, but put that aside. Jack was a big Dennis Naden fan. Jeff was not a big Dennis Naden fan, got rid of Dennis Naden. And I think that Jack would have listened. There were people warning Jeff Immelt about the risks embedded at GE Capital long before the 2008 financial crisis. People like Bill Gross, the bond king, people that Jeff Immelt should have been listening to, people like Jim Grant, the incredible writer and editor of Grant's Interest Rate Observer. Jim Grant is one of my heroes, and he'd been warning Jeff Immelt at GE Capital for years. Other hedge funds had been warning Jeff Immelt for years about the problems embedded at GE Capital, the whole borrowing short and lending long problem. And basically, Jeff ignored them until he couldn't ignore them anymore, in September of 2008.
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, I read Jeff's book. I think you had the opportunity to interview Jeff, right? You interviewed him, right?
For hours, and read his book. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, listen, some of it, you get caught up in things, you get blindsided by certain things. I've made mistakes in my career. I went to go work for Donald Trump. I didn't see the full-on malevolence there. Other people will chastise me for that. That's fine. I accept the criticism, but at least I'm able to own it. I think one problem that people have in those positions, they have a hard time owning or being accountable for the mistakes that they're making. And I think the reason your books are so well done is that you elucidate what people do right and wrong. And it helps you fast track the learning curve, if you will, Bill, where you the more self-aware you are, and the more you can acknowledge your frailty, the better off your career arc is going to be, but also your mental health. And so there's so many reasons why I love your books, but those are some of the main ones. You're an M&A guy. Jack Welch, former M&A guy. Jack Welch made 1,000 deals in 20 years. It's just sort of unbelievable. Did that make the company too big?
Well, I don't, in part, I mean, he was buying companies and selling companies all the time. I mean, basically he and Larry Bossidy were like the original LBO guys. I mean, they were like their own corporate LBO firm, buying and selling companies, all the time. And it did make the company very big, but it also, created a tremendous amount of shareholder value. So, I mean, it's hard to necessarily criticize that. When Jeff took over, he got out of businesses that he didn't like, that he didn't think were right for GE, and he tried to focus it down on what he thought was important. And, again, that gets back to the importance of the choice of a CEO. Because the CEO is the one in charge, as he should be. And to your point, I do think it's hard. It's hard along the way. In fairness to Jeff, it's hard along the way. He's an honest guy. He's an honorable guy. He tried to do the right things. He thought, what he was doing, he thought was right. And again, getting back to the importance of the choice of the CEO, because that's the strategic direction of the company is set by the CEO, and whether to go forward with a acquisition, even if the price is getting too high, or not going forward, all those decisions are made by the CEO. The board has the illusion of authority over the CEO, but I think it's more of an illusion than anything else. Although, if necessary, the board can make the tough decisions to get rid of the CEO, which they did in Jeff's case. But it's hard along the way to realize, to come to the conclusion that the things you are doing incrementally on a daily basis are putting the whole company at risk on an existential basis. And so I know that's hard to do, but you really have to be very willing to listen to people who don't agree with you and hear their point of view, especially when they work for you and you're paying them a lot. And I think that Jack was much better at that than Jeff was. And I think that became also a fatal flaw for Jeff.